Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Kindle Enterprise Publishing webinar on building high-quality PDF files for print-on-demand publishing. I'm Doug, your host for today, of the Global Publishing Solutions team here at Amazon. We work closely with both Indie and KEP publishing teams to improve and simplify the publishing experience for content providers. I've been with Amazon for 13 years and on the current team since 2009. I have backgrounds in graphic design and publishing, and I'm excited to talk to you today about our publishing specifications and requirements. Before we move into our first topic, I did want to note that I will usually be referring to measurements using the imperial system while speaking, but metric measurements are available in the presentation and available resources, including our help page. Speaking of which, all of the information we're going over today can be found on our help page, which you can access by clicking Help at the top of your screen after logging into your KEP account. And one other note, some of the terms and jargon I'll use will be print and publishing industry specific. And while I think this audience will be familiar with them, you can check out the KEP help page for additional clarification. And finally, if you have any specific questions later, you can contact us at any time by clicking the Contact button at the top of your screen after logging into your KEP account. A customer service associate will respond as soon as possible. In today's webinar, we are going to talk about how to correctly size your book's cover and interior files, discuss our requirements for margins, talk about layers, transparency, and font settings, go over our barcode requirements, and finally, end things with a short question and answer session to discuss any questions that you might have after the presentation. Our first topic is how to correctly size your book's cover and interior files. Your book's cover and interior files should be sized precisely for the book's required dimensions. Those required dimensions can be determined with 4 pieces of information: the selected trim size, the book's page count, whether or not the book includes bleeding content, and the book's selected paper type. When determining a book's cover file dimension, the first thing we will need to know is the book's spine width. The spine width can be determined by multiplying the book's page count by the width of a page of its selected paper type. The width for each paper type and the formula for determining a book's spine width can be found on our KEP help page. Once we know the book's spine width, we can precisely determine the required dimensions for a book's cover file using these formulas for the width and height. The required width is made up of bleed, plus the trim width, plus the width of the book's spine, plus the trim width again, plus bleed again. It represents the width of the front cover area, the back cover area, the spine area, and the bleed. The required height is made up of bleed, plus the trim height, plus bleed again. Let's quickly look at an example. Here, you can visually see how the cover's full width and height are calculated. And again, the file should not include any additional surrounding white space or crop or registration marks. Likewise, your book's interior files should be sized precisely for the book's required dimensions as well. All pages should be sized uniformly, and each page of the PDF should consist of only 1 page of content. In other words, do not use 2-page spreads. If the interior includes any content that extends to the page edges, then the file should be set up to include bleed. Be sure to indicate in the metadata spreadsheet that the book includes bleeding content as well. If the book does not include content that bleeds, the interior file's page size should match the selected trim size. For books that do include bleeding content, the interior should be sized at trim size plus 0.125 inches of bleed on the outer three sides of the page. We do not require bleed on the inside or gutter margin where the book is bound, only on the three outside edges where the book will be physically trimmed. Let's look at determining a book's correct interior dimensions using a trim size of 6 inches by 9 inches as an example. The interior file for a 6-inch by 9-inch book that includes no bleeding content should be sized at precisely 6 inches by 9 inches. A 6-inch by 9-inch book that does include bleeding content should be sized at precisely 6.125 inches by 9.25 inches. Let's look at an example of bleeding content. This example shows the file setup for 2 pages from a book that includes bleeding content. The outermost black line represents the bleed line, the next black line represents the trim line, and the innermost black line represents the margin line. This example shows the same 2 pages from the book after it has been produced and trimmed to final size. During production, the book is cut at the trim line and the bleed area is trimmed off. And this is the 2 previous images side by side so that you can see the difference once the bleed is trimmed. And then before we move on, I'd like to open up our first poll. Our second topic is margin requirements. Margins are required to ensure readability and that important content is not trimmed during production. Margin requirements must be satisfied for all sides of the page, the 3 outside edges of the page as well as the inside gutter near the book's binding. That's the middle of an open book. Interior file margin requirements are based on page count and whether or not the interior file includes bleed. This chart shows the minimum margin requirements by page count. These margin requirements can also be found on the KET help page. And this is an example manuscript layout for a 6-inch by 9-inch book with bleed. This is only a sample layout to show the required margin areas. Those margin areas are in gray and the trim line is defined by the dotted line. No live graphics should appear within the gray margin areas. We define live graphics as text or important information on the page. All live graphics should appear in the safe zone fully inside the margin line. Even font ascenders and descenders, such as the letter G in the bottom example, must appear inside the margin line. This is an example cover layout for a 6-inch by 9-inch book. And again, this is just a sample layout for illustrative purposes. The margins are in gray and the trim line is defined by the dotted line. For cover files, all text and important information must appear at least 0.25 inches away from the outside edges of the cover when sized correctly. In other words, that's 0.125 inches away from the trim line and 0.125 inches of bleed beyond it. In order to include spine text, we require that a book have a page count of at least 80 pages. We also require at least 0.0625 inches of space between either side of the spine text and the spine's edges to prevent wrapping onto the front or back cover, which could occur due to print variance. Flattening, layers, and transparency. All layers and transparencies should be flattened in the cover and interior files. Unflattened layers and transparencies can cause errors during processing and manufacturing or result in unintended visual differences in the book when printed. Ensure that all layers and transparencies are flattened so that during processing, the order in which the content was placed on the page remains the same and nothing moves. You should refer to your native software settings or print settings for assistance with flattening layers and transparencies in your file. Another important setting to check is to make sure that all fonts are fully embedded in the cover and interior files prior to uploading. Fully embedding the fonts in the file will ensure that those fonts print correctly during the manufacturing process. Also, make sure that the version of the font used allows for commercial usage. Font usage rights vary from font to font, and not all fonts allow for embedding. You should refer to your native software settings or print settings for assistance with fully embedding fonts within your file. Finally, make sure to include a valid ISBN barcode on the back cover within your cover file. The barcode should be sized at 2 inches by 1.2 inches. It can be smaller if necessary, but the barcode should not be smaller than 1.25 inches by 0.8 inches. The barcode should be comprised of black bars against a white background. Do not use colored barcodes. All of our barcode requirements can be found on the KEP help page as well. Here are a few examples of acceptable and unacceptable barcodes. As noted, barcodes that are not comprised of black bars on a white background are not acceptable. The two bottom examples here are acceptable barcodes. All right. Thank you for joining us today for the Kindle Enterprise Publishing webinar on building high-quality PDF files for print-on-demand publishing. You will receive a follow-up email in the next 24 hours. That email will have a link to the KEP help pages where you can find a recording on the content and the downloadable companion. Happy publishing!